For the past 2 weeks, I've been in Phoenix, Arizona, on assignment for my company. I'm a project manager, and this was a huge opportunity, overseeing the expansion of one of our major distribution centers. Think 12-hour days, juggling subcontractors, dealing with supply chain nightmares, the whole 9 yards. Grueling, but exactly the kind of career-defining grind I'd been working towards for years. Basically, my life had become construction blueprints and caffeine. Then, last night, my phone rings. It's my parents, Dave and Carol. I answered, expecting the usual, "How's the weather?" or, "Are you eating enough vegetables?" Instead, I got a bombshell. "Liam, we did something," my mom stammered, her voice tight with anxiety. My dad chimed in, equally hesitant. It's about your car." My blood ran cold. "What about it?" I asked, trying to keep the alarm out of my voice. We sold it." I stared at my phone, dumbfounded. I must have misheard them. "Sold it? What are you talking about? Who authorized that?" "The car, a 2019 Ford Mustang GT, was my baby." Sure, the title was technically still in my dad's name because of a loan I'd taken out when I bought it, but I'd made every single payment, religiously. It was my car. I needed that car. It was more than just transportation. It was freedom, a symbol of everything I'd worked for. It was my escape when I was stressed, my adventure mobile for weekend trips, and frankly, a damn fine-looking machine that I was proud to own. "There was an emergency," my dad explained, his voice trembling slightly. "It involved Bethany. Bethany is my sister, and anytime her name is mentioned followed by the word emergency, it's never good news. She's a beautiful train wreck, always teetering on the edge of some self-inflicted disaster." I braced myself. What happened? That's when they laid it all out. Bethany's husband, Kevin, had a serious gambling problem. And when I say serious, I mean life-ruining serious. He wasn't just dropping a few bucks on the Super Bowl. He'd spiraled into a black hole of online casinos and shady bookmakers, racking up debts that were astronomical. Not just credit card debt either. These were short-term, high-interest loans, the kind that come with guys in tracksuits and thinly veiled threats. They'd been bleeding money for months, trying to keep it a secret. But the debt had finally caught up with them. They were on the verge of losing their house. The house my entire family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, everyone, had pitched in on as a wedding gift. A beautiful 3-bedroom colonial in a quiet, upscale suburb. It was supposed to be their fresh start, a place to build a life together. We were all so proud to help them get it. My parents, panicked, did what they always did. They tried to fix Bethany's problems. And in their twisted logic, that meant selling my car. "The collectors were threatening to foreclose," my mom said, her voice cracking. "We had to do something, Liam. We didn't know what else to do." "You didn't even call me," I said, the words barely a whisper. The betrayal stung worse than the financial hit. I could have helped. Maybe I could have taken out a loan myself. Anything would have been better than this. They stammered excuses about not wanting to burden me, about how time was of the essence, but I'd stopped listening. The anger was a physical thing, a knot in my stomach that tightened with every word they spoke. "I'm coming home," I said, my voice flat. "Cancel whatever work you need to cancel. I'll be there tomorrow." I hung up and stared at the Phoenix skyline, my mind racing. My dream project, the career advancement I'd worked so hard for, suddenly felt meaningless. My car, my freedom, gone. And all because of Bethany and Kevin's reckless behavior. This wasn't just about the car. It was about the years of enabling, the constant bailouts, the blind loyalty my parents had for Bethany, regardless of how many times she screwed up. I had warned them about Kevin years ago when his gambling first started. Nobody listened. I booked a red-eye flight back to Chicago. As I packed my bags, I made a phone call. It was time to bring in the big guns. Landed in Chicago this morning, running on fumes and pure rage. The red-eye had been packed with screaming babies and the kind of snorers who sound like a dying walrus. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep. My lawyer, Greg, was already on the case. Greg isn't just any lawyer. He's a bulldog, a legal pit bull with a disarming smile and a knack for uncovering dirt. We've known each other since college. He has a keen eye for spotting shady deals and an unshakable moral compass. If there was a way to untangle this mess without me getting completely screwed, Greg would find it. I filled him in on the details from the taxi on the way to my parents' place. "I'm looking into the legality of all of this," he said. "Selling a car that's technically yours, but titled in your father's name, that's a gray area. And we'll dig into these collectors, too. Sounds like they might be skirting the law themselves. Give me everything you have." When I got to my parents' house, the atmosphere was thick enough to cut with a knife. My mom, Carol, was sitting at the kitchen table staring blankly at a cup of cold coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept either. My dad, Dave, was pacing back and forth, his jaw tight, looking like he was bracing for a fight. "Okay," I said, dropping my duffel bag on the floor with a thud. "Let's go through this again, from the beginning." The story was the same, but hearing it again didn't make it any easier. Bethany and Kevin had taken out these short-term, high-interest loans to fund Kevin's gambling addiction. It had started with sports betting, then escalated to online poker, and eventually devolved into ridiculous stuff like virtual horse races and online fantasy leagues. He didn't understand any of them. They managed to make the payments at first, but then the losses piled up. They started borrowing more and more, digging themselves deeper into the hole. Eventually, the collectors came calling. These weren't your friendly neighborhood debt collectors either. They were aggressive, intimidating, and, according to Greg, potentially operating outside the bounds of the law. When the threats started escalating, veiled suggestions of lawsuits and repossessions, Bethany turned to my parents, weeping about losing the house. They panicked. Dave remembered the car. He thought selling it would solve everything, at least temporarily. They found a buyer, took a cash offer that was way below market value, and handed over the keys. No questions asked. I just stood there, trying to process the sheer stupidity of it all. "Did you even ask Bethany and Kevin how they got into this situation?" I asked, my voice rising. "Or were you too busy playing savior again?" Dave bristled. "We didn't have time. The collectors said they were going to act within days." "Of course they did," I retorted. "That's what they always say. Did you even bother to get a second opinion? Check with Greg? Or maybe, just maybe, talk to me?" Carol jumped in, her voice pleading. "We thought we were protecting the family, Liam." "Protecting the family?" I scoffed. "Let's be real, Mom. This wasn't about the family. This was about Bethany and Kevin. They've been making bad choices for years, and instead of letting them face the consequences, you kept enabling them. And the kicker? They didn't even get the full value for the car. They practically gave it away just to get the money fast. I felt like I'd been sucker punched. That car was worth a fortune more than what they'd gotten. "You didn't just sell my car, you sold my time," I said, turning away, fighting to keep the fury from boiling over. "Do you even realize how hard I worked to pay that thing off?" I headed for the door. "Where is Bethany anyway?" "At her house," my mother said quietly. "Not for long," I muttered under my breath. I needed to talk to Bethany. Maybe, just maybe, some of this would sink in for her. But I wasn't holding my breath. I drove straight to her house, adrenaline coursing through my veins. This wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Bethany's house? It was huge, way bigger than anything she and Kevin could realistically afford, even with my family's help. 3 bedrooms, a manicured lawn, and a 2-car garage. It was supposed to be a home, a place to build a life. Now, it was just a monument to Kevin's gambling addiction and my parents' enabling behavior. Kevin answered the door. It was 10 a.m. and he was shirtless, holding a beer. The stench of stale cigarettes and cheap alcohol wafted off him like a toxic cloud. I could barely look at him. He had the audacity to smirk. "Liam, what a surprise," he said, slurring his words slightly. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon." "Where's Bethany?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Kevin shrugged. "Upstairs. Probably online shopping or something. What's it to you?" He didn't even bother to ask why I was there. He knew exactly why I was there. The audacity was mind-blowing. I pushed past him, ignoring his protests. "Get out of my way, Kevin. This doesn't concern you." I found Bethany in the master bedroom, sitting on the bed with her laptop. She looked up, startled. "Liam, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "I'm here because our parents sold my car to clean up your mess," I said, the words dripping with venom. Her face fell, but she tried to play it off. I didn't ask them to do that, she said, her voice defensive. They did it on their own. Oh, really? I said, stepping closer. So what's the plan, Bethany? Just keep gambling until you win big. Or maybe just keep begging Mom and Dad for more money until there's nothing left. She started to cry, the crocodile tears I'd seen 1,000,000 times before. We were trying to win enough to get out of debt, she sobbed. We just needed a little more time. Time? I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. This isn't about time, Bethany. This is about choices. You and Kevin are addicted to the idea of easy money, and you don't care who you hurt along the way. I laid into her, detailing all the ways her actions were affecting everyone in the family. The financial strain on my parents, the stress, the constant worry. I accused her of selfishness, of irresponsibility, of being completely blind to the consequences of her actions. She tried to defend herself, blaming Kevin, claiming she was a victim too, but I wasn't buying it. You're just as responsible as he is, I said, my voice cold. You could have stopped him, you could have gotten help, but instead, you went along with it, hoping you'd hit the jackpot and everything would be okay. The argument escalated, voices rising, accusations flying. I felt a knot of fury in my chest so tight I could barely breathe. By the time I left her house, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this go. If they wanted to gamble their lives away, fine, but they weren't going to drag the rest of us down with them. I walked back to my rental car, shaking with anger. I called Greg. Greg, we've got a mess, I said, my voice tight. I need you to look into these collectors, see if there's anything illegal about what they're doing, and we need to figure out how to deal with Bethany and Kevin before they ruin everything. Greg didn't hesitate. Send me all the details you have. I'll get on it. For the first time since my parents called, I felt like I was in control again. But I knew this wasn't going to be a clean fight. Bethany and Kevin weren't going to go down without a fight, and neither was I. Greg worked fast. By the time I got back to my parents' house, he'd already dug up a considerable amount of dirt on the collectors who were after Bethany and Kevin. Turns out, they weren't exactly playing by the rules. They were using scare tactics, threatening legal action they weren't authorized to take, and charging sky-high interest rates that pushed the loans into predatory territory. Greg said their practices were highly questionable, and we could potentially use that to our advantage. This gives us leverage, Liam, Greg said on the phone. We can threaten to report them to the authorities, maybe even file a lawsuit of our own. But it's a delicate situation. We need to tread carefully. I knew he was right. We couldn't afford to make any missteps. The problem, of course, was that even if we managed to get the collectors off their backs, Bethany and Kevin were still a financial black hole. They'd just find another way to get into trouble. That night, I sat down with my parents. The mood was somber, the air thick with unspoken tension. Here's the thing, I said, my voice firm. The collectors aren't on solid legal ground. We can negotiate with them, maybe even get them to back down. But there's no point in doing any of that if Bethany and Kevin keep gambling. This cycle won't stop until they hit rock bottom. My mother looked heartbroken. We can't just let them lose the house, Liam. It's all they have. And whose fault is that? I shot back, my patience wearing thin. They had a house, one that we all helped them get, and they turned it into collateral for Kevin's gambling addiction. Are you going to keep sinking everything we have into them? Because I'm done. The room went silent. My dad tried to argue, but even he couldn't deny the truth. We'd reached a breaking point. What do you suggest we do then? Carol asked, her voice laced with desperation. I took a deep breath. We need to cut them off, I said. Completely. No more money, no more bailouts, no more enabling. They need to face the consequences of their actions, and until they do, we can't help them. We'll just be throwing good money after bad. It was a harsh ultimatum, but I didn't see any other way. The next morning, Greg and I met with the collectors. They weren't thrilled to see a lawyer, but Greg knew how to handle them. He laid out the legal issues, the potential for lawsuits, the negative publicity they'd face if their practices became public knowledge. Within an hour, they caved. They agreed to take the house in full payment of the debt. No extra fees, no outstanding balance, just the house. It was a victory, but a hollow one. Bethany and Kevin were still going to be furious, and they'd have nowhere to live. I called Bethany to tell her about the deal with the collectors. Predictably, she exploded. "You had no right," she screamed over the phone. "That's my house. You can't just take it away from me." "No, right?" I snapped back. "Are you kidding me? You should be thanking me. You're losing the house because of your decisions, not mine. If it wasn't for me, you'd still owe them more than you could pay in 3 lifetimes." She tried to blame Kevin, saying he was the one who got them into this mess. But I wasn't having it. "You're just as responsible as he is," I said, my voice cold. "You could have stopped him. You could have gotten help. But instead, you went along with it, hoping you'd hit the jackpot." The conversation devolved into a screaming match. Bethany accused me of ruining her life, of being jealous of her, of always trying to undermine her happiness. I hung up, exhausted and disgusted. When the deal with the collectors was finalized, I thought that would be the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. Bethany and Kevin had nowhere to go. So, guess where they ended up? My parents took them in. I told them it was a mistake. A huge mistake. But they wouldn't listen. "They just need some time to get back on their feet," my mother said, her voice pleading. "We can't just leave them out on the street." "Time won't fix this," I warned. "They don't need a free place to stay. They need accountability." But my parents couldn't say no to Bethany, even after everything she'd done. They were trapped in a cycle of enabling, and I didn't see any way to break it. So, Bethany and Kevin moved into my parents' basement, and I braced myself for the inevitable disaster. It took less than a week for the situation to start spiraling out of control. Kevin wasn't just sitting around moping about losing the house. He was drinking constantly, picking fights with my dad, and trying to borrow money from anyone who would listen. He was a toxic presence, poisoning the atmosphere of my parents' house. Bethany wasn't much better. She spent her days complaining about how unfair life was, blaming everyone but herself for her problems. She still dabbled in online gambling, convinced that she was just one big win away from turning things around. Meanwhile, my parents were calling me more and more frequently, begging for help. "Can you send some money for food, Liam?" my mother asked one day, her voice strained. "Kevin's been drinking a lot and we're running low on funds." "No," I said flatly. "I'm not sending you any money. You made this decision. You deal with it." It was harsh, but I wasn't going to enable them anymore. I'd done enough by getting the collectors off their backs. If they wanted to continue to support Bethany and Kevin, that was their choice. But I wasn't going to be a part of it. Weeks turned into months. The tension in my parents' house grew thicker and more suffocating. My dad was losing patience with Kevin's drinking and his constant demands for money. My mom was exhausted from trying to mediate between them and keep the peace. Bethany was slipping further and further into denial. I kept my distance, focusing on my work, trying to rebuild my savings after the financial chaos. I knew it was only a matter of time before something catastrophic happened. And I was right. 6 months after Bethany and Kevin moved in, my parents called me in a panic. "Liam, we don't know what to do," my mother sobbed. "We can't afford to keep supporting them, and Kevin's drinking is completely out of control. He's getting violent." "Then throw him out," I said, my voice cold. "That's what you do. If he doesn't want to change, he's not your problem." My parents hesitated. They were afraid of what Kevin would do, afraid of how Bethany would react. They were still trapped in their cycle of enabling. It took weeks of arguing, of pleading, of threatening to cut them off completely, but they finally did it. They kicked Kevin out. Bethany was devastated. She blamed my parents. She blamed me. She blamed everyone but herself. But for the first time in years, she had to face the consequences of her actions. And that, I hoped, would be the beginning of the end of this nightmare. After Kevin got the boot, an eerie calm settled over my parents' house. Bethany, surprisingly, didn't immediately crumble into a puddle of self-pity. Instead, she seemed numb. She mostly stayed in her room, rarely venturing out except for meals. She was still unemployed, still struggling with the weight of her debt, but something had shifted. Maybe it was the shock of losing Kevin. Maybe it was the realization that my parents were finally done bailing her out. Or maybe it was just the quiet desperation of facing rock bottom. Whatever it was, it felt like a turning point. I remained skeptical, of course. I'd seen Bethany's turning points before, only to watch her relapse into her old patterns of self-destructive behavior. But even I had to admit, this felt different. She started volunteering at a local animal shelter a few days a week. It wasn't much, but it was something. It got her out of the house, gave her a sense of purpose, and surprisingly, seemed to calm her down. My parents were cautiously optimistic. They stopped hovering over her, stopped offering unsolicited advice, and started treating her like an adult who was capable of making her own decisions. It was a welcome change. As for me, I maintained a healthy distance. I'd been burned too many times to let my guard down. I focused on my work, my own financial recovery, and my attempts to salvage what was left of my personal life. The stolen car still haunted me. I still caught myself instinctively reaching for my keys when I wanted to unwind or just go for a drive. I ended up buying a used sedan, a practical but uninspiring replacement for my Mustang. It got me from point A to point B, but it didn't stir my soul the way my old car had. One evening, a few months after Kevin's departure, my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and almost didn't answer. It was Kevin. I took a deep breath and pressed the accept button. "What do you want, Kevin?" I asked, my voice cold. "Look, Liam, I know we haven't exactly been on the best of terms," he said, his voice sounding strangely subdued. "But I need to talk to you." "I doubt there's anything you could say that I'd want to hear," I replied. "It's about Bethany," he said. And Jake." "Jake? Who the hell was Jake?" "Jake? Who's Jake?" I asked, my mind racing. Had Bethany met someone else? Was Kevin trying to start some kind of twisted game? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Bethany's pregnant, Liam," Kevin finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's having my baby." I was stunned into silence. Pregnant? Bethany? It seemed impossible, absurd. How could she be pregnant? She was barely holding her own life together. "Are you sure?" I managed to ask, my voice hoarse. "Yeah, she told me a few weeks ago," Kevin said. "She didn't want anyone to know yet, but I thought you should hear it from me." I didn't know what to say. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. A baby? This was the last thing Bethany needed, and the thought of Kevin being a father terrified me. "What are you going to do?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't know," Kevin said. "I want to be there for her, for the baby, but I don't know if I can." "You can't," I said, my voice firm. "You need to stay away from her. You'll only make things worse." "I know," he said, his voice filled with despair. "But I can't just abandon her, Liam. She's carrying my child." "You already abandoned her," I said, my voice cold. "You abandoned her when you gambled away her house, when you drank away her money, when you lied to her and cheated on her and dragged her down into your own personal hell." "Please, Liam," Kevin begged. "Don't do this. I need your help." "I'm not going to help you, Kevin," I said, my voice hard. "I'm going to protect Bethany, and that means keeping you as far away from her as possible." I hung up the phone, my hand shaking. Pregnant. Bethany was pregnant. The news was a ticking time bomb, threatening to shatter the fragile peace that had finally settled over my family. I didn't know what to do. Should I tell my parents? Should I confront Bethany? Or should I just wait and see what happened? I decided to wait. For now. But I knew that this was far from over. Kevin wasn't going to give up easily. And Bethany, well, Bethany was unpredictable. The storm clouds were gathering, and I had a feeling this was going to be the worst one yet. 2 weeks after Kevin's call, Bethany dropped the bombshell on us. She was pregnant. My parents were devastated. My mom started crying, talking about how they would support Bethany and the baby. My dad just looked stricken, like he was reliving the nightmare all over again. I was beyond furious. How could she be so irresponsible, so reckless? Bringing a child into the world with Kevin, of all people, was just insane. "Let me guess," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're planning on letting Kevin back into your life because of this, aren't you?" Bethany hesitated, avoiding my gaze. "He's still the father of my child," she mumbled. "That doesn't make him a good father," I snapped. "He's a gambling addict, a liar, and a thief. He'll ruin your life, and he'll ruin your child's life, too." Bethany insisted she wouldn't let Kevin back in, that she could handle this on her own. But I didn't believe her. I knew her too well. Sure enough, a few weeks later, I found out she'd been visiting him in jail. I confronted her in the kitchen. "What the hell are you doing, Bethany?" I asked, trying to keep my voice down so my parents wouldn't overhear. She broke down, sobbing. "I can't do this alone, Liam," she wailed. "I need help. He's the only one who understands what I'm going through." "He's not going to help you, Bethany," I said, my voice flat. "He's going to drag you down with him. You know that. Why can't you see that?" "I don't know what else to do," she cried. "I'm scared." "Then get help somewhere else," I told her. "Go to a support group, talk to a therapist, lean on mom and dad, but don't go back to Kevin. It's the biggest mistake you could make." Bethany was stubborn though, and my parents, despite everything, were too soft to stand up to her. They let her keep making excuses for Kevin. They let her keep visiting him in jail, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he wormed his way back into their lives. I felt helpless, watching the disaster unfold. I knew that I couldn't control Bethany's choices, but I couldn't stand by and watch her destroy herself either. Then, something completely unexpected happened. Something that changed everything. Fred's professional gambler friend, the one he'd been working with before he got locked up, got caught in a police sting. Turns out he wasn't just a gambler. He was running an illegal gambling ring, complete with rigged games and laundered money. And guess who was involved? Kevin. The authorities started digging into Kevin's finances and uncovered a web of fraud, including fake accounts, stolen identities, and a whole lot of shady dealings. Suddenly, this wasn't just about gambling anymore. It was a full-blown criminal investigation. The fallout was massive. Kevin was facing multiple charges, including fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. He was looking at serious prison time, but the worst part was that Bethany's name was linked to some of the accounts. Even though she claimed she didn't know anything about them, she was being investigated as well. My parents were terrified. They were convinced Bethany was going to be arrested. They begged me to do something to help her. I called Greg. He was the only one who could navigate this legal quagmire. Greg worked tirelessly, poring over bank statements, tracing financial transactions, and building a case to prove that Bethany was a victim, not an accomplice. He managed to convince the authorities that she was unaware of Kevin's illegal activities and that she had been manipulated and used by him. It was a close call, but in the end, Greg managed to get Bethany cleared. She wasn't charged with any crimes. Kevin wasn't so lucky. He ended up pleading guilty to multiple charges and was sentenced to a long prison sentence. The ordeal was traumatic for everyone. Bethany was a wreck. She lost her job, her friends, and her reputation. She was ostracized by the community and branded as a criminal's accomplice. But even in the midst of all the chaos, there was a glimmer of hope. The nightmare was finally over. Kevin was out of the picture, and Bethany had a chance to start over. A few months after Kevin's conviction, Bethany gave birth to a baby boy. She named him Jake. And for the first time, I saw real change in her. The moment she held Jake in her arms, it was as if a switch had flipped. The self-pitying, entitled version of Bethany vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective mother who was determined to do whatever it took to give her son a better life. She cut all ties with Kevin, refusing to even speak to him. She started going to therapy, finally confronting her own demons and taking responsibility for her actions. She even moved out of my parents' house, determined to make it on her own. Raising Jake as a single mother wasn't easy. She worked a minimum wage job at a local diner, barely scraping by, but she never complained. She was focused on Jake, on giving him the love and support he deserved. My parents, of course, were her safety net. They babysat Jake whenever she needed them to, and my mom practically lived for the kid. She spoiled him rotten, showering him with gifts and affection. As for me, I kept my distance. I'd done what I could for my family, but I wasn't going to let them drag me back into their mess. I visited Jake occasionally, brought him presents, and tried to be a good uncle, but I wasn't ready to forgive Bethany, not completely. Then, one day, something happened that started to thaw my frozen heart. I got a call from Bethany. She sounded exhausted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Liam, can you do me a favor?" she asked. "What is it?" I said, my voice guarded. "I need to go to a job interview tomorrow," she said. "But I don't have anyone to watch Jake. Can you babysit him for a few hours?" I hesitated. I had plans for that day, a golf outing with some clients. But I looked at the calendar, considered my options, and made a decision. "Okay," I said, "I'll do it." That was the first time I'd ever babysat Jake, and it was the beginning of a new chapter in our family's story. A chapter filled with hope, healing, and the possibility of redemption. I wasn't sure what to expect when I showed up at Bethany's apartment the next morning. It was a small, cramped one-bedroom, barely furnished, but it was clean and tidy. Jake, who was about 2 years old at the time, greeted me with a huge grin and a sticky hug. He was a happy, energetic little boy, with bright blue eyes and a mop of unruly brown hair. "Uncle Liam!" he shouted, grabbing my hand and dragging me into the living room. I spent the next few hours playing with Jake. We built towers out of blocks, read storybooks, and watched cartoons. He was a whirlwind of energy, constantly demanding my attention. I was surprised at how much I enjoyed it. I'd never spent much time with kids before, but Jake was different. He was so innocent, so full of life, so completely oblivious to the chaos that had surrounded his birth. When Bethany came home from her interview, she looked exhausted but hopeful. "How did it go?" I asked. "I think it went well," she said, her voice hesitant. "It's just an entry-level position, but it's a start." "That's great, Bethany," I said, genuinely meaning it. "You deserve it." That day marked a turning point in our relationship. It wasn't an instant reconciliation, but it was a start. I began to see Bethany in a new light, not as the irresponsible screw-up I'd always known, but as a struggling single mother who was trying to do her best for her son. I started spending more time with Jake, taking him to the park, reading him stories, and just being there for him. He quickly became the center of my world, and through him, I started to heal my relationship with Bethany. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of tension, of resentment, of lingering bitterness, but we were both working at it, trying to build a new foundation for our relationship. And slowly, painstakingly, we started to succeed. Over the next few years, Bethany continued to work hard, climbing the ladder at her job, saving money, and providing a stable home for Jake. She never forgot her mistakes, but she refused to let them define her. She was determined to break the cycle of dysfunction and create a better future for her son. And I was proud of her, more proud than I could ever put into words. By the time Jake started kindergarten, things felt almost normal. Bethany had worked her way up to a decent-paying job. My parents were retired and spoiling Jake with love and way too many toys. And Kevin, no one had heard from him in years. Frankly, that was for the best. One Thanksgiving, we all sat around the table together. Me, my parents, Bethany, and Jake. As I looked around at my family, at the smiles on their faces, it hit me how far we'd come. The drama, the fights, the betrayals, they were all behind us. We had weathered the storm, and somehow, we'd come out stronger on the other side. That night, after Jake went to bed, Bethany pulled me aside. "Thank you, Liam," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "For everything. I know I screwed up a lot. I don't know where Jake and I would be without you." "Don't mention it," I said, trying to brush it off. "You're my sister. We're family. That's what families do." But we both knew it was more than that. I had played a crucial role in Bethany's recovery, in her transformation from a reckless addict to a responsible mother. And she had played an equally